haven't checked the weather, but I know it is a perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. Like many people, one of my favorite times of the year is award season. And of course, you know I'm referring to the Association of Jewish Libraries Adult Fiction Awards. There were two honor books, Atomic Anna by Rachel Berenbaum, who I had the pleasure of speaking with several months ago, and Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott, who I hope to interview in the future. But for now, it is my honor and pleasure to be speaking with Omer Friedlander, the winner of this award for his collection of short stories, The Man Who Sold Air in the Holy Land. So welcome, Omer, and congratulations on the win.
Thank you for having me.
So one thing that the committee and other reviewers have commented on in your collection is the diversity of viewpoints. How do you put yourself in the mindset of so many different people, girls, boys, different ages, from different backgrounds?
Right. I mean, I think it starts with discovering the right voice for the character and thinking about what they want and what their what their secrets are, what they're obsessed with. And once you kind of figure those things out through the process of writing the story, because I don't sort of plan it in advance, but I kind of discover the character. I always try and put the character in the most difficult position for them in the story. So every story is kind of its own version of hell for that character. It's the most difficult. And I think when you put them in a position that tests them, it's sort of a kind of tailored test for this character, then the character starts to reveal themselves. So I found that to kind of maybe put it more simply, that the character is always connected to the story. They can't always be separated.
Yeah, it was really wonderful reading through, and seeing through the eyes of, children and the elderly and Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Bedouin.
Right.
A couple of your stories kind of incorporate magical thinking. One of the stories that really stuck with me was Jellyfish in Gaza, where there were two twin boys, I'm not sure how old they were, maybe 5 or 6, who kept doing all these rituals that they hoped would keep their father, who is serving in Gaza, would keep him safe. So every time they had a bad thought about him or thought that something might go wrong, they would have to perform a ritual.
Yeah, with that story, I was interested in the viewpoint of a child, and I'm a twin myself. So, so a lot of the stories are about brothers, or brothers feature in them, and this one is really about twins, and I was interested in, I guess, the kind of secret language that twins sometimes have, and with these brothers, the secret language was part of this ritual, like you said, that they believed would keep their father safe, and I guess it was important that the point of view was that of a child, because I think even if the story isn't magical, there's something about the way a child sees the world that you can maybe express through the writing that feels more curious and more alive, and in a way maybe more magical than the way an adult might see the world. So it was really important for me for that story to keep the children's point of view.
Yeah, and in terms of their connection, they often ended up injured doing these rituals, but as they told each other about their injuries, they said it didn't matter whose it was. Whatever injury it was theirs, their communal injury.
Right.
And then they were both so confused when their father did come home, sound in body, but not in mind. And they had no idea of post-traumatic stress, and they were just convinced that someone or something was inhabiting his skin, that this was a mask that something else was wearing instead of their father. I imagine that situation is common anywhere where there is a parent or a family member going off to war.
Yeah, I was really interested in the idea of of a disguise, or someone not being, who they say they are. And I guess especially when someone that close, a family member, or someone like their dad comes back from a war, and he's changed, it feels like there's someone in disguise there, that it's not really their father. And I guess I followed, in a way, the logic of a child, because it's a thought that maybe as an adult, rationally, you wouldn't think, but children can still sort of, they can reach sort of strange conclusions. They have the same sort of set of kind of circumstances, but they reach weird conclusions. And I was really interested in that kind of child's logic, where if the father was so different than what they knew, he must be a different person in disguise.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense from their point of view.
Right.
This probably isn't really politically correct of me to say, but I found two of your stories kind of annoying. Endings are ambiguous. It's like in both Scheherazade and High Heels, the endings are ambiguous. Right. So I think that the character died, but no, they didn't die, but maybe they died. And so I was just curious what your thoughts about ambiguous endings are as a reader and then as a writer.
Yeah, that's a good question. Both of those stories, the ending is ambiguous. It isn't clear. And it is sort of left to the interpretation of the reader. I think they both operate in a kind of fairy tale logic. So with Scheherazade, there's all these allusions to fairy tales, and I wanted to sort of leave the ending to the reader, in the sense that they could complete, this kind of retelling of the fairy tale in their own way. So I didn't. I guess I won't say what the ending is, or maybe I don't know. It took me a while to write the ending for Scheherazade. I remember sort of rewriting it a bunch of times until I kind of reached this point, because I felt like, at least for that story, I couldn't wrap it neatly, or I couldn't exactly say what happens, but I kind of, I guess, leave clues with the structure of the fairy tale, of what you might guess happened if you kind of complete the story.
So you have no sympathy. You have no sympathy for people like me who like things spelled out in black and white. This is what happened next.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a bit cruel to the reader. Yeah. I think as a writer, it's fun to write those kinds of, I guess, more playful endings. But endings in general are difficult, and I think for several of the stories, they're the part that I worked on the most: the endings and the beginnings.
In a short story, that doesn't leave too much left in the middle.
Yeah, exactly.
I did want to talk to you more about High Heels, because I thought that was a really fascinating parallel story. So it takes place current day in Israel, about the son of a shoemaker, whose nickname is Shoelace. Is it Sroch?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And they have a pair of, like, this mythical pair of shoes that the family story says was worn by this famous ballet dancer who perished in the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And it was just, there was a lot of information about shoes, and it was just sort of interesting in our relationship to shoes and to family stories and to history. There was just so much woven into this one story.
Thank you. It was a fun story to write. This story did start with I wanted to write a story about the dancer, Francesca Mann, and the kind of legends surrounding her. But I figured I couldn't really write it directly. I think with some subjects, and I think the writing about the Shoah, for example, is something that is difficult to do directly in fiction, at least. And I needed to find a way to approach it indirectly, I think. And I realized that I could do it through this kind of parallel story. So I became I guess, interested in, in shoes because it's such a big part of Francesca Mann's story. And it was fun to kind of just to keep researching. I had no idea all this stuff about shoes. So that was really fun. I also talked to a friend of mine who designs shoes, and she kind of showed me, how to describe certain things and elements of the making of it. So I'll get, some of the details right, at least for someone who, who isn't an expert. And yeah, so I kind of interwove those stories, and it was also important for me to have this kind of thought in Scheherazade, where he isn't really sure if the story is true that his father tells him about Francesca Mann and her shoes, or if he made it up. So I wanted to leave it kind of to have it, I guess, become part of the central conflict. Do you risk your life to bring back these shoes that have this great meaning to you, even though you might know that the story behind them is completely made up and they're worthless? So I wanted that kind of tension to exist in the story.
Yeah, well, it almost doesn't matter if the story is true or not. It's a family story, and so that carries its own truth, whether it's a historical story or not.
Right, and it kind of is maybe more significant because the story is also about the relationship between Solch and his father, and the way they both betray each other, maybe in different ways. The father with this story that may be true or not, and Solch with kind of bringing these two people into the shoe shop, into their lives, Monkey and Gecko, the urban night climbers.
Right, the son and these two other characters like climbing rooftops and cranes with all the construction going on.
Yeah, that was kind of, I'm kind of scared of heights, so I never did that. That part of the research was I just watched videos and read about it. But even watching the videos is scary. But I wanted to leave. I wanted the ending to leave the reader, I guess, kind of hanging and unsure of what happens.
You were successful. So it sounds like you did have to do a lot of research into that story. Did you do research on most of the stories?
I did, yeah, in different ways. Sometimes the research came after I wrote a story, and I needed to kind of fill in the blanks, or to give the world of the story kind of a more concrete sense of reality. And sometimes the research inspired the story. But yeah, I'd say different kinds of research, reading about certain historical periods, or watching documentaries and things like that, but also talking to people, to some experts. And so, for example, in the Jellyfish in Gaza story that we talked about, I talked to someone who was in several wars, and kind of now works with people suffering from PTSD. So that was kind of really interesting to hear his perspective on the story, and some of the kind of describe some of the reactions that people have in surprising ways. So things like that, I think, were, even if they didn't make it directly into the story, following the conversations, it was really interesting to learn more about it.
I just have to ask one silly question. I know you're on the East Coast. Have you been to the Shoe Museum in Toronto?
No, I haven't. I should go.
It's fascinating. It's totally fascinating. Just everything you could possibly wonder about shoes.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to go. Yeah.
In the miniaturist, so much going on in a short story. So these were two who illuminated manuscripts in Spain, and then were kicked out, and so these were competing families in Spain, and they both left and went to, was it Isfahan in Iran? And again, kept this competition going for generations and generations and generations. And then they both families end up in the same refugee camp in Israel, right after the formation of the state. And so it's this friendship between the two girls of this family, and I mean, it's just so funny that they have nothing left except this competition and this rivalry. The father says, "Oh, don't speak to her."
Right.
But it's also difficulties between the girls because one has inherited the family talent and is, an enormously talented illustrator, and the other one not so much. And and people are asking her to draw this for them, draw that for them, do a portrait. And Adina, the not so talented one, is feeling really bereft of the friendship because Esther's off doing something else, and just sad that she doesn't have this talent and isn't getting this attention. And I'm just smiling because you have a funny word play. So when she's talking to her father about it, she asks about the mini tsaurus instead of the miniaturist, so the mini problem.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think there's many places where you need to know Hebrew to catch a word play, but that was one of them. It's like, ooh, I understood it.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask if those were historical houses, if there was such a rivalry.
So it's not really. I made the rivalry up, but I sort of I talked to a professor who studies these illuminated manuscripts, and I showed him, a draft of the story, and we kind of figured a way to, I guess, that I could write it that that wouldn't be totally implausible, maybe. But I made up this kind of rivalry, but I was interested in I guess a kind of rivalry that stretches for generations, and how these two girls find a way to, in some ways, overcome it and become friends, but also the tensions are still there. And for that story, the beginning and ending, if you remember, it starts with a big snowstorm and it ends with a big snowstorm. So those were the biggest, I guess, snowstorms in Israel. So I think 1950 and then 2013 were kind of especially harsh winters, and I wanted, I guess, that kind of connection, even if it's just an image or something, because I jump forward, so much in time, and the narrator is remembering her friendship with Estelle. I wanted the snow to kind of remind her of her time in the tent city, and that took me a while to sort of figure out that I needed another snowstorm. But I think once I figured that out, the story sort of had its own logic, even though it felt kind of a risk to jump forward, several decades. But I hope, the snowstorm kind of connected it.
Yeah, it did. And another thing about that story is that it really brought home the different experience of mainly Ashkenazi Jews coming from Europe and the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews coming just a little bit after that. And that it makes the point without making the point that their situation was so much worse, and that they were in these tent cities for years waiting for housing to be built and villages to be built and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a part of Israeli history that's still sort of, swept under the rug and ignored. And it's sort of, I think people are returning to it again and again, but at least it felt to me like something that I wanted to explore with the story. And it's something, so yeah, I guess I know a little bit from my grandmother, who came from Egypt and was in a Ma'bara for about a year and a half, I think. So maybe not some of the longest, but still a long time. But she sort of never talked about it. But I became interested in it, I guess, because of that silence around it, the mystery. I don't know.
Yeah, I was about to ask if she told you stories. Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's a lot of grandparents who left a difficult situation didn't want to talk about it, or even if they left a good situation, still wanted to look forward and not back.
Yeah.
One story that had me laughing out loud a couple times was the Sephardi survivor, about some kids in school during Holocaust Remembrance Week, when a lot of the Ashkenazi kids are bringing in their elderly relatives who are Holocaust survivors, and they were Sephardic and didn't have one. Although I do want to jump in and say that many Sephardic families did indeed experience the Holocaust. I think that's another myth, that people think it was only the Ashkenazi, but there were plenty of them affected also. But they had this Holocaust envy or survivor envy. I forget exactly what word you used. And so they found this confused old man on the street and brought him home. And basically they decided he was going to be their survivor. And not just any survival story, they had him surviving the most outlandish series of events. So tell me more about that story.
Yeah, it came to me because I was actually in Brooklyn with some friends, some Israeli friends, and one of my friends whose family's from Iraq, he said something like, I was always jealous of my Ashkenazi classmates who had relatives that were survivors, and I thought it was kind of a strange thing to say, and it really kind of interested me, and so I figured that the only way to write this kind of story is to make it absurd and sort of strange and kind of a little magical about this kind of rivalry. So I had the kids find an old man and sort of kidnap him, I guess, and make him pretend that he's their grandfather. But I wanted this kind of symmetry of they want a different kind of story for their family maybe, and Yuda, the survivor that they find and pretend he's their grandfather, he also wants a different kind of story. So it's a kind of story about storytelling in a way, and they each kind of with him they rehearse a different kind of story of survival, even though his story is I made it kind of like they watch all these movies and they have this kind of vision in their head and they wanted to make it more exciting, or this kind of I was interested in the way the Holocaust is represented in popular culture and in films, and because that's maybe some of the only ways children see it, and especially now that survivors are so old, the ones that are left, it's sort of becoming harder and harder to hear testimony, and pretty soon it won't be possible firsthand. So I was interested in the kind of that representation, and I mean it's a subject that was always kind of hovering in the background because my grandfather is a Holocaust historian and survivor, and I didn't grow up reading his books. They're pretty but when I was older I did read some of his work, and so it's something that's definitely in the atmosphere of my house.
He also became entrenched in the house briefly for that week or so he was there, and he was yelling at the kids to clean their backyard, to clean up the garden. So it seemed like it a little bit worked both ways. He's like, okay, I'm going to be the grandpa. This isn't the kind of yard I would live with.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I needed both sides to have some kind of goal or something they wanted, a reason for him to stay and a reason for them to keep him there. And so the garden became part of that story. Why is he staying? And the whole situation is sort of absurd that they would kidnap an old man, but I guess the logic of the story is that you kind of go with the premise.
Yeah, and that was kind of the idea behind your title story also, the man who sold air in the Holy Land, who is, I don't want to say a con man, that's putting it way too strongly, but he was basically trying to sell bottles and said, here's air from the Holy Land. And he got his very cute daughter to become engaged in this too, to be a salesperson.
Yeah, exactly. I was interested, yeah, in the idea of a kind of con, but I guess, like you said, it's not really sort of malevolent. It has this kind of almost childish quality to it.
Right. It's sort of, people play along with it. I mean, that people obviously know this is ridiculous, but
Yeah,
they play along.
and I wanted it to be part of the kind of strange dynamic that he has with his daughter, that it's a relationship that's, you know, partly about this kind of imagination and the stories they have together. And part of that is when they go to the dolphinarium, which is the kind of wreckage of what once was a nightclub, and before that was a kind of an actual dolphinarium where dolphins, I guess, did tricks and stuff, where they go there and imagine that there's still dolphins there. So the whole story is kind of about this relationship between them, and the way that the daughter, who's very young, the way she kind of starts to realize that, starts to not believe her dad and in the stories that he tells her. I think he also realizes some of that at the end.
Yeah, there's a certain point where she can't just play along anymore, that she needs to grow up, basically.
Exactly.
So is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to answer?
I mean, I thought the questions were so great. I always get asked about writing in English, but instead of Hebrew. But
Okay, so
yeah.
what's it like writing in English? Obviously, you're brilliant at it, so I didn't ask.
It's I guess it's a certain way of having a little bit of distance from the material, maybe. And I guess because it's all set in Israel, and even if it's historical and all that, it's sort of, the subject matter feels familiar in some ways. Then writing it in English gives me a little bit of that, I guess, perspective on it. So that's part of the reason. But yeah, it wasn't a conscious decision. It was more, it just happened. Because I lived for a couple of years in New Jersey with my parents, and learned English there for the first time, and it sort of stuck me. And yeah, so I guess kind of by accident.
So do you write other types of things?
I mostly fiction. So now I'm working on a novel, which feels pretty different to the stories. But I've mostly been I'm mostly interested in fiction. A little bit of kind of nonfiction, memoir things here and there. But I'm mostly interested in inventing.
I was asking if there are other types of things that you write that you would write in Hebrew rather than English. Maybe about, if you were writing about the United States, would that be in Hebrew to give it that outsider look?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question. Maybe we'll have to see. It always takes me a while after I live in a place to write about it. So I haven't written about the US at all. But maybe in a couple of years, who knows?
Sounds good. And I usually ask if people are working on any other projects, and it sounds like you're working on a novel.
I am, yeah, and it's for now it's still a secret.
I usually end by asking people if they would like to have a soapbox moment. If people were to use your book as a stepping off point for Tikkun Olam, for fixing the world, what would it be? Or really, you can just talk about any issue that you would like right now.
I'm not sure about using my book for it, but I guess if we're sort of, it's a podcast that is associated with libraries. One place that people could take a look at is the Levinsky Garden Library in Tel Aviv. So it's in the southern part of Tel Aviv, and it's a kind of library in this park, the garden, and it's mostly for the residents of that neighborhood, which are refugees from Sudan and Eritrea. So and they do really really good work. So I guess that would be my my pitch.
Okay, wonderful. And if someone wants to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
The best way would be through my website. So there's a contact page. So I get those emails.
And your website is?
Just my name. Yeah.
So omerfriedlander.com?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking to me. It has really been a pleasure. And congratulations again on winning the Association of Jewish Libraries Adult Fiction Award.
Thank you so much.
So it was well deserved.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
You too. If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite Board and Brick or online bookstore or at your local library. Thanks to Dianki for use of his Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find more about it at www.jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode.
This is Martha Simpson, Chair of the 2023 Sidney Taylor Book Award Committee. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast. I'd like to dedicate my episode to my husband, John, who called out, "More books for Martha," every time we received another package of books. And he cooked dinner so I could have more time to read them all.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish kidlit. Join me to hear my conversation with Martha Simpson, chair of the Sidney Taylor Book Award Committee, to hear about the 2023 Sidney Taylor Book Award winners at bookoflifepodcast.com.